service to us in terms of understanding what happened to us, because that has been a really big, weird black box in the middle of this scandal.
And it could, in the end, show us the dimensions of interference in the election, the ways it can be done beyond what we already know, and what, if any, role the NRA played in that.
Yeah, and McClatchy reported earlier this year that one of the things the FBI was investigating was whether the NRA had been used as a conduit for money. We haven't seen the money side of the Russia scandal laid out very clearly. There's been a lot of allegations, but if that's actually what happened with the NRA, and Butina was part of that, presumably we'll get access to that. If this was also something that was coming directly out of Putin's inner circle in terms of her connection with this Russian official, Alexander Torshin, that presumably will get us much closer to the Russian side of the command and control on this. I mean, she's potentially a hugely important new development here if we're going to get clear on what exactly she was up to. And
it boggles the mind. If she is in any way a threat to Vladimir Putin, how is she going to live the rest of her life?
Exactly.
How is this going to work?
I was at my news meeting with my staff today. We heard that she was going to plead. And so, we were all talking about the possibility that she would also have a cooperation agreement. And I was there standing there confidently saying, that is inconceivable. Right. Inconceivable. That definitely couldn't happen. Now, apparently, it's happening.
There we are. Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks, Lawrence.
Well, the legal ground has shifted quickly under President Trump since he was named as individual one by federal prosecutors on Friday, who described in a sentencing memo for Michael Cohen how Donald Trump directed Michael Cohen to commit federal crimes to benefit Donald Trump's presidential campaign. Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff, who is himself a former federal prosecutor, said yesterday that President Trump now faces the possibility of jail time.
There's a very real prospect that on the day Donald Trump leaves office, the Justice Department may indict him, that he may be the first president in quite some time to face the real prospect of jail time. We have been discussing the issue of pardons that the president may offer to people or dangle in front of people. The bigger pardon question may come down the road as the next president has to determine whether to pardon Donald Trump.
Unless, of course, Donald Trump pardons himself before leaving the presidency. Impeachment proceedings against a president begin in the House Judiciary Committee. The House Judiciary Committee, which in the cases of President Nixon and President Clinton conducted weeks of investigative hearings before the committee voted to send articles of impeachment to the full House of Representatives for their consideration. The chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, who will have that duty in a Trump impeachment if that happens, is Democratic Congressman Jerry Nadler of New York City, who will become chairman of the Judiciary Committee when the Democrats take control of the House in January. At the beginning of last week on this program, Congressman Nadler was a bit reluctant to talk about impeachment. It was the day after the president tweeted his approval and encouragement about Roger Stone, saying that he will refuse to ever testify against Donald Trump. That tweet was reasonably interpreted by many legal scholars to be clearly witness tampering on the part of the president, which was actually one of the counts in the articles of impeachment that the House Judiciary passed against Richard Nixon. I asked Congressman Nadler how he would approach the possibility of impeachment now that President Trump has already publicly crossed a line that Richard Nixon crossed.
We're going to have to look at all the evidence that the special counsel comes up with, the things that are being done in public, the things that we find out that are being done, and make decisions. There's certainly things that he has done, such as what you just mentioned, that give the appearance of witness tampering, that give the appearance of obstruction of justice. Whether they amount to that and whether you can prove those charges is a different question. But there's certainly evidence, and we'll have to look at all of that.
That was Tuesday night. Perfectly reasonable response. There's evidence. We're going to have to look at all the evidence. Here's Jerry Nadler yesterday discussing what we learned on Friday from the federal prosecutors who said in writing that Michael Cohen committed federal crimes to influence the outcome of the 2016 presidential election, quote, in coordination with and at the direction of individual one.
If it's proven, are those impeachable offenses?
Well, they would be impeachable offenses. Whether they are important enough to justify an impeachment is a different question, but certainly they'd be impeachable offenses because even though they were committed before the president became president, they were committed in the service of fraudulently obtaining the office. But the fact of the matter is that what we see from these indictments and charging statements is a much broader conspiracy against the American people.
In less than a week, the incoming chairman of the House Judiciary Committee has gone from very careful statements about having to wait to look at all the evidence that the special counsel comes up with to yesterday saying, yes, what we learned on Friday about Donald Trump would be impeachable offenses. Individual one has changed everything. The presumption that has floated around Washington for decades that the President of the United States cannot be indicted is being challenged more and more every day. Harvard Law professor Lawrence Tribe has now concluded that the President definitely can be indicted. He will join us later in this hour with his reasoning for why the President can be indicted. Individual one really has changed everything, which is to say Michael Cohen has changed everything for Donald Trump. Michael Cohen's guilty plea combined with the federal prosecutors putting it in writing that Michael Cohen's crimes were committed in coordination with and at the direction of individual one has changed everything for Donald Trump. Now there is talk of indicting the president. Now there is talk of jail time for the president. And now there is talk of impeachment. The chairman of the committee who has jurisdiction over impeachment in the House of Representatives is saying yes. If the federal prosecutors on the Michael Cohen case can prove what they say about individual one, then yes, President Trump committed impeachable offenses. Washington can feel where we are now. Washington can feel what is coming now. An impeachment investigation by the House Judiciary Committee is all but inevitable. When he becomes chairman, Jerry Nadler no doubt will wait for Robert Mueller to complete his investigation, and that could take several more months. But then, Jerry Nadler's Judiciary Committee is going to have to investigate what he called impeachable offenses yesterday. At minimum, the House Judiciary Committee is going to have to investigate how the president coordinated with and directed Michael Cohen to make illegal payments to two women to buy their silence in the final days of the presidential campaign about their sexual affairs with Donald Trump. Even individual one now realizes that impeachment is a real possibility. CNN.com is reporting tonight that a source close to the president says that President Trump sees impeachment as, quote, a real possibility. Everyone in Washington can feel where this story is going now, including individual one. The United States Senate has a literary form called the Dear Colleague letter. It is usually a letter sent by one or more senators to all 100 senators. A Dear Colleague letter can be about relatively obscure, unimportant things, but sometimes they are about the most important issue of the day. And tonight, in the Washington Post, 44 senators have published and co-signed an extraordinary Dear Colleague letter to all 100 United States senators. The 44 senators signing this letter are all former senators, both Democrat and Republican. It says, Dear Senate colleagues, as former members of the U.S. Senate, Democrats and Republicans, it is our shared view that we are entering a dangerous period, and we feel an obligation to speak up about serious challenges to the rule of law, the Constitution, our governing institutions, and our national security. We are on the eve of the conclusion of Special Counsel Robert S. Mueller III's investigation and the House's commencement of investigations of the president and his administration. The likely convergence of these two events will occur at a time when simmering regional conflicts and global power confrontations continue to threaten our security, economy, and geopolitical stability. During our service in the Senate, at times we were allies and at other times opponents, but never enemies. We all took an oath swearing allegiance to the Constitution. At other critical moments in our history, when constitutional crises have threatened our foundations, it has been the Senate that has stood in defense of our democracy. Today is once again such a time. We urge current and future senators to be steadfast and zealous guardians of our democracy by ensuring that partisanship or self-interest not replace national interest. Leading off our discussion now, Mimi Roker, former federal prosecutor and MSNBC legal contributor, Jed Sugarman, professor of law at Fordham University, and Brian Klaas, assistant professor of global politics at the University College London and a columnist for the Washington Post. And Mimi, it really does seem as though Individual One has changed everything about this, and very quickly. You hear Adam Schiff talking about jail time. We're going to hear Professor Tribe in another segment talking about, of course, the president can be indicted as a sitting president. Jerry Nadler now. These are impeachable offenses. 44 former United States senators tonight thinking this is the moment. And they describe it there as the convergence of both what they believe is the end of the Mueller investigation and what they are sure is the beginning of an impeachment process in the House. They didn't use the word impeachment, but they're talking about House investigations. Everyone can feel where this is now.
And part of that, Lawrence, is remember, for so long, we were only hearing Trump and Giuliani and his surrogates, and they were controlling the narrative. What you have now, both from Mueller and from the Southern District, is facts and evidence are coming out. And you can spin those, you can make arguments, but it's really hard to really knock those down when they come out. And I think that's what happened on Friday night. You had this trilogy in 3 different documents of facts about Donald Trump, Individual One, in one document, and clearly implications about him in the Mueller documents that just scream of criminal behavior, frankly. We don't have, it's like reading a book where you have separate chapters, and we've got a few of the chapters, and some of the lines are blacked out, like with Flynn. But we're starting to get all of the chapters, and we need to see the whole book. With Cohen, with that memo that the Southern District wrote, they lay it out as good of a case as anyone could about how this president, with Cohen, manipulated the American public to get to be president. And that is serious. And by phrasing it the way they did, they essentially said, without using the exact words, we can prove this, and it's not just Michael Cohen. I really believe that's the way that should be read.
Yeah, and that's the kind of latest stage of revelations. James Comey, in an interview with Nicole Wallace, took us back to what it now seems like a story so long ago, the obstruction of justice that might be brought against the president and possibly an impeachment process, involving him telling James Comey to drop the Flynn case. Let's listen to what James Comey said about that, because it's important to remember this is also part of the totality of what the House of Representatives will be considering when they take a look at the president's conduct. Let's listen to this.
He asked me to drop the investigation. I just replied by agreeing that Flynn's a good guy, which had been my experience, very friendly, a nice person in my interactions. And then shortly thereafter, it ended. And I left and went very quickly and wrote a memo writing down everything that I had remembered. And then I emailed my staff, who had prepared me, a lot of work to prepare me to give the first counterterrorism briefing to a new president. And I said, the briefing went fine, but now I have to write another memo. And they knew what I meant, that something had happened. And then I sat with them and said, look, read my memo and let's talk about what we should do, because obviously it's evidence of obstruction of justice.
Judge Sugarman, obviously evidence of obstruction of justice.
Yes, I think that's actually several points that we have on a case of obstruction of justice. But I think what makes the obstruction of justice claim much stronger than it has been. There's already been evidence, and Trump essentially confessed to obstruction when he told on NBC to Lester Holt that he fired Jim Comey because of the Russia investigation. That was already enough for many people, for me, to conclude that it was obstruction. But the key thing is we're going to learn why Flynn pleaded guilty and what he's given to Mueller that will deepen the understanding of what Trump was doing when he asked Comey to let him go. That's another key episode in this obstruction claim. Keep in mind that while Michael Cohen might be facing 4 years for a certain set of crimes, Flynn is facing 0 jail time based upon Mueller's request for his cooperation, and he was implicated in crimes that are arguably far worse than Cohen's. So what I'm reading in between the lines here is that Flynn has given the goods and given a lot more information to Mueller, And if we find out what that is, that will make a sort of vague obstruction case to the public much deeper and much more alarming.
And Brian, when you look at the list of those 44 senators who signed that letter to the Senate tonight, the Washington Post, 11 Republicans, many of them very solid Republicans, Alan Simpson, Jack Danforth, Dave Durenberger. These are many of the really serious players in the Senate during their time in the Senate, like Bill Bradley, Bob Kerrey, John Kerry on the Democratic side of it. I'm not sure when the concept for this letter was born, but I'm sure it was speeded up after Individual One was described by the federal prosecutors.
Yeah, I mean, this is people from both sides coming together and saying this is bigger than one party. This is about rule of law in America. It's about democracy. It's about the things that we should agree on. And I think when you look at the totality of the picture here, you have now 5 people around the president, senior people, his campaign chairman, his deputy campaign chairman, his foreign policy advisor, his former national security advisor, and his personal lawyer are all convicted felons. And the net is closing in on Donald Trump, but not just one net, many of them. You have the credible allegations of tax fraud from the New York Times. You have credible allegations now of him basically committing felonies around campaign finance. You have the conspiring with the Russians. You also have the obstruction of justice charges. And then you have Adam Schiff talking about credible allegations of money laundering. So all of this stuff is stuff that we should not disagree on. It's not acceptable. It's disqualifying. And it's so sad to see that we have lowered the bar so much that you just have to commit a crime for people on the Republican side to think the president is disqualified himself. It's so below the office, and it's embarrassing America globally.
Well, Brian, that was, it seems to me, what the senators were going for in their letter. They're talking about let's rise above partisanship. It seems to me that letter is much more directed at the Republicans in the Senate who have been so reflexively defensive of everything the president does.
Yeah, and I mean, the sad thing about that letter is a lot of those Republicans are part of a dying breed of the Republican Party, a breed that says we are not enemies, that doesn't cheer when the president says the press is the enemy of the people, that doesn't cheer when the president scapegoats minorities and uses rule of law as a weapon against his opponents or to protect his political allies. So I think there needs to be a moment in this country where we come together around those principles that used to unite us and stop having blue and red, especially red in this instance, that are absolving the president of effectively criminal behavior or alleged criminal behavior.
Let's listen to something that was probably a surprise for Fox viewers to hear from Andrew McCarthy talking about the case against Michael Cohen.
The Southern District of New York case, which is different from the Mueller case on Cohen, they are clearly going after the president on campaign finance violations. Yeah. And I think if you read the sentencing memo the Southern District filed in Cohen's case, it's clear that Trump is the target and he'll be indicted eventually.
Mimi, your reaction?
Look, I think what's clear from the memo is that they have evidence of his participation, his direction, his coordination. To say that they're going after him, I just don't think we know that yet, because there are a lot of legal and logistical hurdles, right? I mean, for the Southern District to indict Trump, I mean, I don't want to get too much into the sort of legal weeds here about it, but there's statute of limitations issues and whether or not those would sort of stop and you can hit pause because he's the president and maybe he can, maybe he can't be indicted. I know there's a strong view that he can, but they would need to get the permission of the attorney general. I mean, there's just a lot of sort of hurdles for the Southern District to get over. But what's clear, I think, is that they have the evidence. So the question is, what happens to that? And should the president be immune from that simply because he is president? And then the idea that the statute of limitations might run while he's president. And the whole way that he got to be president to enjoy this immunity is through a manipulation, I think, of the system, the campaign finance system, and deception. So it doesn't make sense that he can't be held accountable. So he does need to be held accountable. Whether or not the Southern District is going to be the one to do that and bring charges, I think is still very much an open question. But it's hugely important, as we were just saying, that they have the evidence. And that evidence needs to go somewhere, whether it's through them or to Congress or some other mechanism.
Well, the Southern District has never been the supplier of information for an impeachment proceeding, but this might be their first time. This might be what happens. Mimi Roger, Jed Sugarman, and Brian Klaas, thank you for starting us off tonight. And when we come back, what would happen if President Donald Trump actually did shoot someone on Fifth Avenue, as he once suggested he could do and get away with it? Harvard Law School professor Lawrence Tribe joins us next with the answer, which is, of course, he would be charged with that crime. And later, no one, and I mean no one, wants to be Donald Trump's chief of staff. So what would happen if Donald Trump went out on Fifth Avenue and shot someone during the presidential campaign? He said that he could do that and his supporters would still vote for him. And that might be true about his supporters, but what is also true is that the NYPD would immediately either shoot and kill Donald Trump on the spot or arrest him and charge him with murder. Today, Harvard Law School professor Lawrence Tribe tweeted, if Trump shot someone, he'd be indicted in a New York minute. Nothing in the Constitution prevents his indictment for directing a criminal conspiracy to steal the presidency. Certainly not a Justice Department policy. Joining our discussion now, Lawrence Tribe, Harvard Law professor and constitutional scholar. He is also the co-author of To End a Presidency, The Power of Impeachment. Professor Tribe, thank you very much for joining us tonight. You've published an op-ed piece in the Boston Globe about the ability to indict the president. How do you see this?
It seems to me that the only argument against indicting the president is an assumed policy on the part of the Justice Department that says he's too busy, and therefore we should wait. Now, that's not a very convincing argument. If he's got time to sit for a Senate impeachment trial, he's got time to sit in an ordinary criminal courtroom. Besides, it's not a binding policy, and what has occurred to me is it couldn't be a binding policy. It would be unconstitutional to immunize a president who has committed a serious crime, especially a crime of fraudulently obtaining the presidential power, and to immunize him until he leaves office. And the reason is quite simple, although nobody seems to have made the point. People worry about Trump abusing the power of the pardon. But there is another way the pardon power enters the picture. It's the way Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon. Now, the framers were absolutely clear that because a president who is convicted by the Senate of impeachable offenses cannot be punished, he can just be expelled from office. But there he sits with all his ill-gotten gains, the emoluments from Saudi Arabia, Russia, every place, and he gets to keep it all, even though in the meantime he's done a lot of harm to the country. That's not what they had in mind. They specifically said in Article 1 that because the president can't be punished by the Senate, he has to remain liable to trial and punishment afterwards. Now, how could that work if the president and the vice president, as part of a ticket, the way it's been ever since 1804, they've run together, if they get into office together, the president abuses his power, and then if he either leaves under threat of impeachment or resigns for some other reason, or is actually convicted, all he does on the way out is arrange with Pence, look, why don't you get the national nightmare over with and pardon me? And Pence says, you're pardoned. And then he can never be held to account. And those who say, well, of course the president isn't above the law, he isn't outside the law, he's not a king, he's not a monarch, he's not a two-bit dictator, we'll get him eventually. But eventually is never if the scenario works out the way it would obviously do. Now, I'm not saying there's necessarily a corrupt bargain between Pence and Trump, but no president is going to pick a vice president who isn't at least likely to give him a get-out-of-jail-free card on his way out the door. And that means that the only way the framers design to hold everyone accountable to the law can be made to work is not having a policy against indicting and trying a sitting president. If the president were indicted and openly indicted while he's still president, there's no way Pence would get away with pardoning him after that. The only reason that Ford could get away with pardoning Nixon without himself being impeached and removed for abuse of power is that Nixon had not been indicted of any crime. But in this case, we have what looks like a looming indictment of a serious felony that was directed and coordinated by the guy who wanted to be president in order to help him become president. Seems to me that all those people who've said that a sitting president cannot be indicted will have to reconsider in light of this serious constitutional argument.
You know, I've always believed the president can be indicted simply because if the founders wanted otherwise, it'd be the easiest possible sentence to insert in the Constitution, to simply say that the president cannot be indicted. But it does seem to me that on the impeachment clause in the Constitution, there is the possible implication of this, because it says that after the president is impeached and removed from office, the president can then be indicted. That would be an implication, possibly, that the president should not be indicted while a sitting president. Do you think that, you don't seem to think that is a strong enough implication in the Constitution, if it is one?
I think it is not a strong implication. On the contrary, it gets things upside down. The language that you're talking about, Lawrence, of Article 1 says that the judgment in an impeachment case shall not extend further than removal from office and possible disqualification, but the person convicted shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment, judgment, and punishment according to law. That says he shall be liable. And if he could be pardoned easily by the person who assumed the presidency without ever being elected by virtue of being the vice president, could simply wipe that away, then he would not be liable to punishment. The ordinary sequence might well be to impeach and remove first, but if a president has committed a crime in order to get to office and has combined the office and his business interests in a way that might be inimical to the United States in order to enrich himself and his family, then the only way to carry out the Constitution's design without making the pardon power and the guaranteed liability to criminal punishment clash with one another is to remain open to the possibility of indicting and trying the president while he is in office. And it seems to me that that's the only coherent way to read the Constitution and to understand its history. Because the framers said they were concerned about the corrupt acquisition of presidential power. The incentives would be all the wrong way if a president could bribe electors or hide things from the voters in order to become president and then be guaranteed that he would never serve a day in jail.
Harvard Law Professor Laurence Tribe, an honor to have you with us once again. Thank you very much for explaining that to us tonight. Really appreciate it. And when we come back, President Trump likes to humiliate the White House Chief of Staff, especially when he's firing the White House Chief of Staff. But the guy who Donald Trump tried to hire as the next White House Chief of Staff has now humiliated Donald Trump. White House Chief of Staff is one of the most prestigious and sought-after jobs in Washington. I mean, it was until Donald Trump took the oath of office, and now no one wants it. I mean, literally, no one wants to be the next White House Chief of Staff. The president loves humiliating the White House chief of staff by firing him publicly before the White House chief of staff gets the word directly from the president. Donald Trump fired his first White House chief of staff on Twitter, and then on Saturday announced he was dumping John Kelly to reporters before getting on a helicopter to go to a football game.
John Kelly will be leaving at the end of the year. We'll be announcing who will be taking John's place. It might be on an interim basis. I'll be announcing that over the next day or two.
That was Saturday. And now, after a day or two, the president has been humiliated because the person he was going to name as the next White House chief of staff in the next day or two decided to turn down the job on Twitter on Sunday. Nick Ayers, who's been serving as Vice President Pence's chief of staff, tweeted, "Thank you, President Trump and Vice President, my great colleagues, for the honor to serve our nation at the White House. I will be departing at the end of the year, but will work with the Trump team to advance the cause." The New York Times is reporting advisors to Mr. Trump were stunned by the turn of events. One former senior administration official called it a humiliation for Mr. Trump and his adult children, an emotion that the president tries to avoid at all costs. Joining us now is Adam Jentelson, former Deputy Chief of Staff to Senator Harry Reid and now the Director of Public Affairs for Democracy Forward. Adam, the White House Chief of Staff job has been the top achievement. Most people have had the job. That's the biggest thing on their resume. And now literally everybody in Washington whose name gets mentioned as a possibility immediately says publicly, I don't want it.
Yeah, I've never seen anything like this. I mean, it's the most powerful staff job in the world. The White House Chief of Staff is more powerful than many members of Congress. So to turn it down is just unbelievable. It's unheard of. To do it in the manner that Ayers did it is even more, like you said, humiliating. So it's hard to watch, but it really is amazing. And I think the only reason you would do that is if you were afraid of the position that having the job would put you in.
Yeah, and the other thing is everyone knows what is going to happen to the next White House Chief of Staff. At some point, you are going to be fired publicly on Twitter by Donald Trump before anyone tells you that you're fired.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, I mean, it's such a powerful job that some people might take it even knowing that the end would result in humiliation. But at this point, with everything you laid out in the previous segment about where the Mueller investigation is going, I think there might be an even bigger consideration, which is being afraid that having the job would place you at serious legal liability and involve you in something that is probably going to end in jail time for a lot of people and has already ended in jail time for a lot of people. So, you know, a lot of people out there are probably shameless enough to take the job knowing they would be humiliated, but going to jail is another thing entirely.
Congresswoman Barbara Lee tweeted on Sunday, before General Kelly steps down, I hope he will offer a long overdue apology to Congresswoman Frederica Wilson for lying about her in the press. And Adam, what we saw in that episode is that John Kelly revealed himself to be every bit as horrible a liar as Donald Trump. That, for me, was the turning point on John Kelly. I learned everything I needed to know about him in that exercise, where he completely lied about Congresswoman Wilson. And then, the most important part of it, then did not apologize. When it was all made public that he lied, less than 24 hours after doing it, he never apologized.
Yeah, that was a shameful episode. You know, there's a saying that power doesn't corrupt, it reveals. And what it revealed about John Kelly is that he is a man who likes to use his power to hurt and humiliate people, just like his boss. There's the episode you mentioned. And of course, he's a man who oversaw a policy of ripping, screaming children out of the arms of their mothers at the border. So this is a man who seemed to relish the opportunity to use his power to hurt people, and that tells you everything you need to know.
Adam Jentelson, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Lawrence.
And when we come back, the author of the article that is headlined, Mueller is telling us he's got Trump on collusion. A new article in the Daily Beast suggests where the Mueller investigation is going. Under the headline, Mueller is telling us he's got Trump on collusion. Max Bergman writes, Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation will likely implicate the president, his campaign, and his close associates in aiding and abetting a Russian conspiracy against the United States to undermine the 2016 election. The article uses the public documents released by the Mueller investigation to piece together what's next. Bergman writes, in Michael Cohen's sentencing memo, Mueller said that Cohen provided his office with useful information on Russia-related matters core to its investigation. One of those central elements, according to the Justice Department, any links and or coordination between the Kremlin and the Trump campaign figures. Collusion, in other words. The article notes that the sentencing memo on Michael Flynn says that Flynn's calls with the Russian ambassador during the transition were material to the investigation into links or coordination between Russia and individuals associated with the Trump campaign. And finally, Bergman points out that Cohen's plea deal reveals that Trump was compromised by a hostile foreign power during the election because while Trump claimed during the campaign to have no business dealings with Russia, he was negotiating a wildly lucrative business deal, not simply with Russian businessmen, but also involving the Kremlin itself. Max Bergman will join us next.
Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing.
Russia was listening. Joining us now, Max Bergman, director of the Moscow Project at the Center for American Progress. And Max, in your article, you make the case that Mueller is already telling us through his court filings that he does have the president on collusion. What is your case that Mueller has revealed to us through his pleadings?
So, Lawrence, I think the range of potential outcomes of the Russia investigation have really narrowed in the last 3 weeks. 3 weeks ago, you could sort of say, well, maybe this isn't going to pinpoint collusion. Maybe this is all about obstruction of justice. But no, I think we now know that Mueller is focused on his core mandate, which is to identify coordination between the Trump campaign and the Russians. And we know that for a number of reasons. One, as you outlined, there's a number of people that are cooperating now with the Mueller investigation about collusion. That is Paul Manafort, that is Michael Cohen, and Michael Flynn, who have all been providing information that is important to whether the Trump campaign coordinated with the Russians. We also now know that Trump was compromised during the election. We know this because of Mueller's findings about Trump trying to negotiate a deal with the Kremlin during the campaign over a Trump Tower in Moscow. And the third thing is we now know that this is going to be really expansive in terms of the potential cover-up, in terms of the obstruction of justice. Michael Cohen was didn't just plead guilty to lying to Congress, but he also admitted to potentially providing information publicly that other people could use to sort of participate in this cover-up. And we know that Paul Manafort was secretly trying to backchannel information potentially to the Trump legal team. So I think we're looking at a really broad breadth investigation. But importantly, we know that the collusion story is core to Mueller's mandate and is one that he's focused on intently.
And as it happens today, the latest news we have about a cooperator with the Mueller investigation is the Russian Maria Butina, who presumably will have a whole new world of information to open up to Robert Mueller.
Yeah, this is potentially really significant because Maria Butina, she pinpoints what is a broader Russian effort to interfere in our politics, not just the 2016 election, but our broader politics. And what were the Russians trying to do? They were trying to infiltrate the Republican Party, infiltrate the far right. And the way they figured out, the way they identified how best to do that was by infiltrating the NRA. And this is an extremely important case, and I think one that we're going to hear a lot about in the days, weeks, months going forward, and has a lot of implications on what the NRA actually did during the 2016 election with all their spending that was at record high and some of the money that has allegedly been received from Russia that contributed to NRA's efforts during the election period.
We saw in this extraordinary letter by 44 former senators to the United States Senate tonight that they seem to believe that the Mueller investigation is nearing its conclusion, which is why they wrote that letter. As you put these pieces together, do you have a sense of a guess, I would say, about where we are in the timetable of the Mueller investigation?
You know, this is a really tricky question. I think one thing that we can say for sure is that Mueller is very far along in his investigation. That when you have, as a cooperating witness, the National Security Advisor, the president's personal lawyer, the deputy campaign chairman, and then for a time in Paul Manafort, the campaign chairman, you have a lot of people that are participating in this investigation, helping you, trying to advance it. So I think we're looking at Mueller moving forward. But one of the problems, Lawrence, is everywhere Mueller looks, he finds potential crimes. And so that is, how does Mueller sort of cut the threads on the investigation and bring it to a close is a big question. So we may be far from the end.
You're saying that if the information would just stay static, the end might be closer, but the crimes keep tumbling out and adding to what he's looking at. Max Bergman, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Tonight's Last Word is next. Time for tonight's Last Word. Last week, we introduced you to Tiffany Kapanda, a Kind Fund Scholarship recipient who is now in her first year at Chancellor College in Malawi. She got there with the encouragement of her grandmother, Rose, who insisted that Tiffany work hard in school. Dora tweeted, "Lawrence, I cried listening to Tiffany. I look forward to more success stories." And Summer tweeted, "I start a new Christmas tradition this year with a gift of education to a girl in Malawi." Donna tweeted, "Made my kind donation. I loved school and these students are an inspiration." The Kind Fund, Kids in Need of Desks, is the partnership that I created with MSNBC and UNICEF to provide desks to schools in Malawi and scholarships for girls to attend high school in Malawi, where the girls' graduation rate from high school is much lower than the boys. There are many reasons why girls have more of a struggle staying in high school in Malawi. You can help girls like Tiffany finish high school, or you can contribute desks to schools at thelastworddesks.msnbc.com. You can specify that your contribution is for desks or for girls' scholarships, and you can do it as a gift for anyone on your holiday gift list, and UNICEF will send them an acknowledgement of your gift. Any amount that you can contribute will be very helpful. Tiffany would not be in college today if you had not supported her with the scholarship that got her through high school.
I just want to say again that I'm grateful for the scholarship that you gave me. I am here because of you people, and thank you very much.
Tiffany Kapanda gets tonight's Last Word.
The people in the room, they gasped. It then became clear what